So this session, as you know, is about trust and leadership, and this is just a series of sessions which I'll go into in more detail. Just a health warning sign here that please don't take what I say as sort of written in stone. This is just a pure exploration, I guess, of the evidence around leadership and trust in leadership. And there's lots of information here for you to take away and do your own research and come to your own conclusions. So please don't take my word for any of this. And as you probably know, I've been running this series of Change Thoughts talk. The next one's on neuroscience, Wednesday, 6th of July, and we have 1,748 people signed up for that. So if you do want to sell anything, put neuro or brain in front of it, and you'll sell loads of tickets to your events. Can other people let people in? Is that okay?
Yeah.
You can do that. Brilliant. Thank you. And then finally, we have this building capability for organisational change. And the idea is that over the last few months, we've been building kind of a new basis for our knowledge base for organisational change. And this current session is one of the sessions. There'll be 16 sessions following this on building capability for organisational change. And this is the first of those. So I'll be running, the next one is on fairness and decision making, which I just set up this morning. And then there'll be another one on psychological safety and organisational support. So the idea is that I'm now starting to build an evidence base of evidence-based knowledge on how organisations can really change. So in this session, I'm just going to be talking about what's the problem with leadership theory at the moment. And I don't know if people saw my article on this on LinkedIn when I was just sort of exploring some of the issues with leadership theory. What are the traditional sort of styles of leadership? So what's our current sort of mental models of leadership, and how do we challenge those? How do we figure out really what works on the ground in terms of operationalizing those theories? And then finally, how do we build trust, because that seems to be central to building effective leadership during change. So what's the problem? So if you did see my post on LinkedIn, and please feel free to chip in on this. I mean, literally, it took me 20 minutes, and I found 40 different types of leadership, and that's. I read another article that said there were around 60, and this is problematic because the more constructs we have, the more difficult it becomes to differentiate them. There's always sort of overlaps, and we're just renaming things and putting new wine into old bottles. And I just think, from a scientific point of view, if we want something to be meaningful to people and be able to operationalize it, we need to be able to differentiate it from other things, and we need to understand how those things interrelate. And to summarize that, and people, sorry if people have seen this before, but I'm going to start all my sessions with this. It's so important, I think, and this is an article that was written by Sotheby, who I think sort of summarised this issue very well, who was the editor for the Academy of Management Review, and he was saying he gets all these papers submitted and people don't understand why they're not being published, and he's saying because the constructs aren't valid, i.e. the things that they're describing aren't properly defined, the scope's not clear, the relationship with other elements of our sort of knowledge base aren't clear either. And just to go into this in a bit more detail, in our brains, obviously we construct things, we construct these sort of abstract categorizations, and that helps bring meaning to our lives, so we understand, what is a pipe and what is a cigarette. So in terms of leadership, we have moral leadership, for example, which overlaps with, we have authentic leadership and ethical leadership and servant leadership, and all these things overlap with what we could call moral leadership. So when someone talks about moral leadership, what are they talking about? They're talking about authentic, ethical, or servant. And even under ethical leadership, what do we really mean by ethical leadership? And the same, you see definitions: strategic leadership, visionary leadership, transformational leadership, and they obviously all overlap with each other. And the second point here, the scope. So what do we mean? What do these concepts mean in time and space? So what do they mean in a particular context? So autocratic leadership, you might say, oh no, that's a really bad thing. But in fact, if you want people to comply, if you want people to comply to certain standards within an organization, say around safeguarding, and there's no question that people have to follow certain procedures, then autocratic, clear instruction is what you want. But if you're dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty, maybe you want to have a more consultative and democratic approach to your leadership. And so we see this sort of trend towards place-based or context-based leadership, which seems to be coming into fashion now. And we also need to understand how these constructs link together with other constructs, not just within leadership. So if for instance, we're going to have effective build trust in leadership, then we need to understand how trust in leadership relates to, say, ideas around fairness of decision making, or how it relates to things like psychological safety, because people won't openly discuss their relationship with leaders if there isn't psychological safety, and discussing those relationships is around building trust and showing vulnerability. So all these constructs then become interrelated, and we need to understand what the relationship is. And if we get all those things right, then we have a sort of coherent, valid construct, or we start to have a coherent, valid construct. And this is the sort of backbone of everything that I talk about, and is particularly applicable to leadership. And if we don't do that, then we end up in this situation where we just sort of make up leadership styles. So here's an example from Dennis Torish, who's a professor of leadership at organisational study at Royal Holloway, and he's written a book called Management Studies in Crisis, which is fraud, deception and meaningless research within management studies. And he says, particularly within leadership, we just make up a positive adjective and stick it in front of leadership, and then we imagine a theory around it. So he uses this idea of athletic leadership. So athletic leaders are winners, and they're driven, and they demand the very best out of their teams. So that's our conceptualization of athletic leaders. And then we gather evidence. So we'll maybe interview some particularly athletic CEOs who say, yes, I'm a really high performing CEO because I'm very athletic and I go for a run every day. And then you create a questionnaire to say, right, athletic leaders run every day, do triathlons, they're resilient and all that sort of stuff. And then you go around and people fill out, and you say, oh yes, you're definitely an athletic leader. And then you start to formalize a hypothesis and say, athletic leaders are high performers. And then you test it, and then before you know it, you've got a new construct. And clearly, if we keep on doing that sort of thing and that kind of research, then we end up with a bit of a pseudoscience. So what's the alternative? Or so what are these traditional leadership styles that that sort of come about, and what's the history? So the history of leadership development, theory development, started off with this idea, I guess, which is more genetically focused, and the idea of a great man. Obviously, it had to be a man and not a woman. That leaders are naturally born, and I guess this paves the way for all sorts of dodgy theories based on genetics. And then, thankfully, during the 40s, Kurt Lewin comes along and runs an experiment with his colleague Lippitt to understand in a school what the different types of leadership are, and he talks about autocratic, democratic, and delegative, or kind of laissez-faire leadership, where you're allowing others to make decisions. So there's more sort of trait-based leadership styles, and then you've got behavioural leadership styles, which are based on the skills of the leaders during the 40s and 50s. And then, interestingly, an area that I'm particularly interested in the 60s and 70s is we get this idea that actually organisations and individuals in organisations are not islands. They act within a context, and so organisations are affected by the external context. So you get this lovely article that you can read online for free. Emery and Triss, 1965, talk about open systems and environmental textures. So how is the organisation responding to the texture of the environment in which it's working? So you get more what's called contingent leadership. So leadership is based on the circumstances of what's going on externally and internally within the organisation. And I guess from that autocratic and democratic and the sort of situational side, we get these ideas of transactional and transformational leadership, which become dominant ways of interpreting leadership styles. And this transactional is based on cost benefit, which is sort of social exchange or type of theories around, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch your type of thing. The ideas around reciprocity within relationships, and this inspirational style, which is the transformational style, and that those ideas start to sort of really grow during the 80s and 90s, and then during the 2000s we get lots of different styles of leadership being invented on the back of that, because there's areas that are missing within transformational leadership around servant leadership. Obviously diversity inclusion becomes a big thing, so inclusive leadership and complexity. So we have complex leadership, and you can see agile leadership and everything else. So that's what's been happening, and now we get more of a movement, I think, back to or a simulation of all of that, and back to the more contextual leadership, or in the public sector now people talk a lot about leadership of place. So what's my leadership style given the circumstances that I'm in, given the power of the politics in which I'm working, which is quite interesting. And I guess the idea of transactional and transformational leadership for me comes down to one of the key paradoxes in organizational development, which is about getting this balance of autonomy and structure. And this is what, if you've worked with leaders in organizations, this is probably one of the first things that they'll talk to you about is, how do I balance individual freedom? So I want people to flourish and grow, and how do I balance that against trying to drive organizational objectives and organizational outcomes? I want people to comply to what the organization wants, but on the other hand, I want people to feel that they have a sense of autonomy and they're participating in the decision making. And this goes again all the way back to the 1960s around the sort of contextual and contingent sort of leadership styles. And this is also the foundation of diversity and inclusion as well. How do you balance people's drive to stand out with people's drive to want to fit in, this sense of belonging versus this sense of autonomy as well. But really, these two styles go back to Lewin's conception in 1938, about transformational and transactional leadership. So more recently, and I guess you can break this down further. Sorry, I didn't realise these were on. You could break these down further into this structure and autonomy and structure. So autonomy, is around exhibiting welfare for individuals. This sort of transformational leadership fits with that sense of autonomy and giving people sort of a broad direction, but allowing them to be themselves and achieve. And I guess the more structured side, which is the transactional, which is the sort of doing the process focus. So that's my just sort of very simple interpretation. And people say in organizational change, well, actually, we need to have the more transformational leadership. We want people to be given a clear vision and a clear way forward, but feel empowered and motivated to go out and make the change themselves. And in fact, in this Mythbuster, which is based on this book, Reconsidering Change, that actually the research tells us that we need both a transformational and transactional leadership style, that in order to get people to do and achieve, we need to be quite transactional. But on the other hand, we need to have a clear vision of where we're going. But also other researchers has suggested that we need to have a more servant style leadership as well, that this is actually a servant leadership style is actually a more unique leadership style above, say, being ethical or authentic. So if you look at Kotter, for example, Kotter will talk about transformational leadership. You know, he wrote a book on it, whereas you go to Prozai, for example, and they're a bit more transactional because they're dealing with change at an individual level. You know, so transactional is more tactical, transformational is more strategic, and will create sort of proactive pro-social behaviors, but that's fine, but people still need to know what they're doing at the task-based level. So that's why we need to have both of these things. And in fact, when you go through the literature and when you read Reconsidering Change, one of the big factors that underpins all of this is trust in leadership, that organizational change, that becomes a foundation and a starting point for change. So I just went through, you know, all the sort of literature to try and understand what are potentially redundant constructs. And this is me very much in my transactional and transformational mode before I read more widely about leadership. And really, that, you know, there is so much overlap, and there's studies here you can see by Banks and Hodge, trying to understand, is there any real validity in having all of these different types of transformation? In fact, ethical and authentic overlap, and we'll talk about that in more detail, but certainly servant stands out, and we'll have and feminist leadership as well potentially stands out, but that's about more male female gender traits, which we'll talk about, which is potentially controversial, but yeah, this is just showing that there is lots of overlap, and there's references there if you want to read about that in more detail. So really, I guess because there's so much overlap, and even transformational and transactional leadership, or particularly
Alex,
yeah.
Is it okay to ask questions in between?
Yes, sorry, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, yeah.
Just on your last slide, maybe you're coming to this, I'm missing situational leadership, which basically says, depending on the situation and the one you want to lead and the leadership situation itself, you choose. Have you also looked at that, or where would you put this in here?
Yeah, so yeah, the situational or sort of context or place-based, and I'll come on to that.
Okay.
So let me and see if I cover that properly for you.
Right.
But yeah, that was included in my top 40, but I don't have time to go through all the 40, but yeah, we can touch on that.
Because I thought they also try to close this gap between whatever the situation or the one in front of you needs, whether it's transactional or transformative leadership style. So I found the approach itself quite interesting.
Yeah, it is, and and that comes into, you know, when do you delegate? When are you autocratic? When are you democratic? And so yeah, we'll come on to that. Hopefully, I'll answer that.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Thanks, guys. So yeah, there was this article published in 2013, which is just basically saying we should just abandon all ideas around charismatic and transformational leadership, because it falls into that slide that I showed you earlier about not being properly defined, about causality not being you know, properly understood, and what Kniepenberg, if I've said his name right, suggests is that we should abandon the concepts, but we should keep the elements that are relevant. And this seems to be a potential, I think, is a potential way forward, that when we talk, rather than talk about charismatic transformational leadership, we should talk about the elements of what that means. So that could be visionary leadership, it could be fair leadership, it could be trustworthy leadership, it could be coaching style of leadership. So what kind of leadership, and I think this comes back to your point about situational leadership, is what type of leadership style do we need to adopt given the situation that we're in. So this is what these guys are saying, that we should just really break these leadership styles down. So this gives us an idea of potentially what will work if we're breaking down and being a bit more specific about what kind of elements of these leadership types work and what don't work. Maybe we can operationalize them and they become a bit more meaningful, and we can do some more meaningful research around them. And there was this article by Antonakis, who has written a lot. Well, he's a professor in leadership, and he's also very critical, and he also is the editor of Leadership Quarterly, and he wrote this article doing another critique of how we develop leadership concepts. And I actually thought this was a good model of how we can build leadership capability in organizations. So he was saying, and I've adapted this very much to try and operationalize it, but the fundamental question is, why do we need leadership? So what's the problem we're trying to solve within? So we expect leaders, I've just used an example here, we expect leaders to be ethical, for example. So we have issues of leaders being unethical. So that's the problem that we're trying to solve. So what are the behaviors? What's the difference that we want to see? So we have to define what the behavior is that we want to see, which is, I don't know, unethical behavior could be, say bullying somebody or something. So we need to understand what the interrelationship is. So how will that behavioral impact other issues, other capabilities that we need for change? So that could be resilience. It could be that we have a high turnover rate because people feel that the culture is toxic and it's a bullying sort of culture, and that's undermining people's resilience. So we need to understand what the interconnection is. So what are we expecting to see change as a result of that behavioural change in the leader? And then, so what would be the impact of that in different situations? So maybe some parts of the organisation have less issues with this, and maybe this is quite focused on one area, or maybe it could be toxic leadership across the whole organisation potentially, or bullying across the whole organisation, or this is just something built in the culture that those behaviours are tolerated at all levels. And so what's the causality? What kind of relationships are we expecting to see? So has the behaviour changed, and have the outcomes been demonstrated? And then that allows the organisations to start building leadership capability. So because we're learning, we know that this behaviour, if I do this, then X and Y, Z will happen within the organisation. And then we start to build our own internal knowledge base of what works and what doesn't work. And then we start to justify, actually, well, our leadership style does have impact, and we understand what that impact is. We can maybe try and replicate it or try it in different areas. And I think this is something you can use at an organisational level, as well as it should be applied at a sort of a research level as well. So let's just go into that in a bit more detail. We're breaking down behaviours. If you use the research that's been done in these different areas, you can start to see different behaviours popping up or becoming a bit more explicit. So ethical leadership, what do we mean by ethical leadership? And I was quite surprised by this, actually, that ethical leadership kind of boils down to holding people to account. So that's actually quite a transactional style of leadership. So who's actually holding the leaders to account in that example of a bullying sort of culture? So who's holding who accountable for calling out bullying behaviour or questioning bullying behaviour, for example? Authentic leadership, that comes down to behaviours around self-awareness. So how do I demonstrate that I want to become more self-aware as a leader? And that will hopefully drive people's view of whether I'm authentic or not. And servant leadership focuses on follow. So this is this point that was made, that we need to really drill down into the behaviours of these different leadership styles and understand what works and what doesn't work. Sorry, this shouldn't And I think this helps. It helps to simplify. So rather than having these huge sort of definitions of what leadership is, it helps us to really hone in on what the behaviours are that we want to see, the specific elements. And it then overcomes this issue of overlap. So transformational leadership is around developing others, but so is servant leadership. And, you know, but maybe a unique area of servant leadership, which you don't see in transformational leadership or transactional leadership, is this idea of power sharing, for instance. So we really we can have conversations around what do we really mean by leadership in this organization. Another source of trying to understand what these behaviors might be is if you look at the scales or the surveys that are used to measure these different constructs as well. So my leader helps me generate a sense of meaning, enhances my capacity for moral action. Well, what does that mean in this context, in the context in your organization? What kind of behaviors do people expect to see in their leaders in order to make people feel that you know, they can enhance their capacity for moral action? And there's even a question as to whether these questions are even valid themselves, but hopefully it gives you an idea, allowing you to pinpoint a bit more. So how do we really solve this leadership issue that we have, which could be, you know, trust in leadership, which we'll come on to.
The question here, if we go back to that previous, it's just that you talk about the power and the power dynamic there and about power sharing, but there's an assumption there that power resides in a particular place and it moves from one point to another. And there are multiple different perspectives in that. And if, on the previous slide, the first statement that you had there, if you could flip back one, use power in the service to others, not for his or her ambition. There's Keith Grint, I can't remember the quote is precisely, but essentially his notion of leadership and power was that the power of a leader is derived as a consequence of the actions of the followers. It's not the cause of the actions of the followers. So you've got a completely different understanding of power. And I think the point here that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with is the suggestion that, you know, I have power that I can distribute and I can give. Actually, I don't believe that to be the case. I think more of it is about being cognizant or conscious of where power disparities naturally exist and figuring out how do I make that easier to bridge both ways as a leader and as a follower, whatever that may be. So again, it's just that when you start getting into this, you start unpacking, you bring in other constructs, you think, well, actually, how well do we understand these constructs as well, and that we're talking about as an integral part of how we understand leadership?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's where, thanks, Angus, that's where servant leadership comes in, because I think servant leadership, as you say, looks at it from a completely different perspective, doesn't it? That I'm here, actually, the only power that I have is the power that my followers give me, rather than, as you say, the power that I sort of distribute and hand out to others. And so that's why it was seen as being unique from transformational leadership, and is added to the sort of party, as it were, because it's flipped our idea. And I think this is where place-based leadership comes in as well, because place-based leadership asks the question around, you know, how do leaders do have power, you know, they do have a natural sort of power, they're in a position of power, they can make decisions that others can't, but how does that power affect the dynamics of the group that then I'm working in? So if I go and meet trade unions, for example, and I have the power to make decisions around working hours or something, how does that affect the dynamic of me talking to those unions and coming to an agreement? And yeah, so that's all in that place-based type leadership, which I found quite interesting, although it seems to lack clear definition or any sort of reason, but it's an idea. Yeah,
but I think what's interesting, I think as a practitioner, I'm less hung up about the absolute clarity of definition. I think that's much more of an academic perspective. In order to be able to study and research a topic, you have to be very, very clear about what it is you're studying and what you're not studying. I think for me, the question of leadership is around what difference does that make in reality, in real life? Whether I call it servant leadership or I call it distributed leadership, or I call it, you know, aardvark leadership. You know, I'm quite sure that'll have been developed at some point by somebody. because it seems to be everything's got a name. But what's this fixation we have with badging everything rather than badging it? What about unpacking it and understanding, what are we talking about here and what are the implications of what we're framing here, rather than let's be really clear about what we are framing and what we're not.
Yeah, and I think for me, I guess the danger is two things. Firstly, that people sell servant leadership, don't they? So they'll go into an organisation and say, right, you have to adopt a servant leadership style, and we've got no idea necessarily, well, not servant leadership, but maybe authentic leadership. What is that? What are the implications of that? What's the problem we're trying to solve? What are the behaviours that we expect to see from that? All of that is just not defined. So I think there's a danger there as well. And I think you're absolutely right that as practitioners, we should be focusing on what is the behaviour, what specifically, and you can badge that under pretty much any leadership style, maybe. You're absolutely right. Thanks, Angus. And just whilst I'm here, do leaders have an adequate understanding of ethics? And I think this is the point, isn't it? That even ethics, we think we all know what we mean by moral leadership or ethical leadership, and in fact, as you're discussing here, we don't. So we have to get down to what is the specific behaviour. You bully me, I feel bullied when you do X. I want you to stop doing X. How do I practice those behaviours that stop me doing that thing? And does that stop doing that thing make me feel differently about this being a bullying sort of culture? Thanks, guys. Great, that was a nice pause. Please feel free to interrupt. So I thought this was interesting, that we should be moving beyond the individual. And in fact, we've known this from the 60s. There's definitely a push from literature. And Angus, you mentioned, the sort of academic view that is moving away from, coming up with new concepts. And certainly lots of people are writing around, don't come up with new styles, but don't think about the individual qualities, but trying to understand the importance of the context and the system in which they operate. And this is a literature review done for the National Leadership Centre, who did all the training for the Cabinet Office and all the civil servants and stuff, which I guess, given what's going on in the civil service at the moment, toxic accusations of toxic environments, probably a steer in the right direction. So and also I just thought I'd touch on this, just because I thought it was a bit of fun, but actually it's actually quite serious. That and one study particularly caught my attention, and I didn't realise that there was quite a bit of research into this, because I spoke to Professor Hock about her research, and I was saying, well, what do you think about feminist research? And she was saying, well, there's no gender differences in leadership, so why would we talk about feminist leadership as opposed to sort of male leadership? So I looked into that, and in fact, there does seem to be differences in gender. And there was one study conducted in the US amongst governors of states in terms of the number of COVID infections, and they found a correlation between, and I'm sure they sort of considered other factors that might cause it, but they said that women state governors had lower levels and was perceived to be managing the whole COVID crisis a lot better than men, and that seems to support evidence that women leaders are much better in crisis than the male leaders, or generally women are just better leaders. So I don't know, I just put that out there, but there does seem to be some evidence to support that. And I don't know whether that is because women need to adopt certain behaviours to get ahead in a male dominated, which have to be different from, they can't just seem to be men, they have to seem to be, and that actually those behaviours being a bit more reflective, asking questions, whatever, challenging in a very subtle way, not undermining male egos, is actually a good way of leading. Anyway, I'll put that out there.
Alex, I'll just add to that one. So I would say that I've seen both. So I would say that in corporations, an awful lot of very senior leaders who are female basically adopt the male stereotypes because that's what they need to be successful and to fit in with that tribe. I would say when it comes to COVID and those mass ones, I suspect some people are happier taking empathy from a female because that's what societally nurturing whatever than they are from a male. So I think that might be becoming mushroom soup there. I suspect there are some styles that work whether you're male or female. I think it comes down to the leader and how they apply it rather than gender clarity. I think it's very mushed up.
Yeah, no, I think so. And you definitely, but I don't know. I never know whether to approach this stuff or steer away from it because it can get quite controversial.
I've seen the most horrendous alpha people who are literally just, they adopt the socially acceptable behaviors of their peer group around them, whether they are male, female, whatever, you know, and that diversity of style disappears completely. And I think that's the biggest shame, irrespective of gender, orientation, whatever. And I think that's part of the inclusivity argument.
Yeah, I would suggest that actually we have to talk about these things, not just gender differences, but other topics that are a bit uncomfortable, we've avoided for years. If we actually want to make meaningful progress, we have to be willing to have some uncomfortable conversations. And be, you know, risk, you know, people pointing fingers and saying, well, you know, that's a sexist perspective. Absolute crap. It's a meaningful conversation.
Yeah, no, and I agree, Angus, and I think the meaningful conversation comes back to this point about not what gender you are, but what behaviours are you exhibiting. Whatever can encourage people to talk about, okay, you know, females seem to exhibit this kind, and it seems to be beneficial. Why don't we get more men adopting those kind of? If it comes to that, if it's about what specifically works in different contexts, that's a useful conversation, isn't it? What's not useful, I guess, is saying women are always better, men aren't because they're, you know, or men are aggressive and women are passive. That kind of thing doesn't help. But and this is why I think talking about the specific behaviours is so important. What works in what circumstances, regardless of gender. Anyway, there you go. It always creates a bit of discussion. So worth throwing in there maybe. So finally, just coming on to how do we build trust, because this is specifically about trust, and this sort of refers to, I'm referring a bit to the research here, and also some qualitative analysis that was done by CIPD with Bath University after 2008, when there seemed to be this sort of issue around loss in trust in leadership again, due to, you know, questions around ethical leadership in banks, and I guess that's coming again. Sorry, Angus.
Veronica's research you're referring to?
I don't know actually. Who?
Veronica Hope Haley.
Could be.
It's about building and the acquisition and the rebuilding of trust.
Yeah, it could be. I'm not sure exactly who did it. That's from Bath University anyway. But yeah. Is she at Bath University then? Yeah,
she was the dean of the business school there, and trust was her area of particular. Trust and change were her two areas of particular interest.
Brilliant. Okay, well you can help me out with this then. Hopefully you probably read this. So what they found, and I got this diagram from, I don't know who Rachel Botsman is, but I copied it off the internet and I quite liked it and thought I should refer to it about this. You know, and this is fundamentally change, isn't it, moving from the known potentially to the unknown in this sort of sea of uncertainty and ambiguity. And certainly this is what the CIPD report found, was that when the stakes are high, you know, when there are potentially going to be conflicts of interest, which often happens in change, then trust tends to matter more. So when we are in the state of uncertainty, trust becomes more important. And this is our business, isn't it, in terms of change. And change can be broken down, trust can be broken down into these four areas, which is, if I want to build trust, then I have to be seen to be benevolent. Sorry, there's a timer on this, which is, anyway, I should have taken off. We have to seem to be benevolent, and we have to be seen to be capable or have the right ability. And we also need to be, our behaviour needs to be predictable, which again, emphasising being very specific about the behaviours that we want to see, because if we're going to have predictable behaviour, we're going to be very clear on what the behaviour is and just keep doing it. And we've got to have integrity as well, which is around sort of fairness of decision making. So I sort of summarise this into consideration and structure, which I thought also helped with this idea around, sorry, this is annoying, around this idea of structure and autonomy as well, that benevolence and ability, benevolence is around considering the individual and abilities about the individual, and structure is around, more transactional style, creating predictability and integrity in decision making, holding people to account. So I wondered whether this sort of ties into that transformation. Not that we want to categorize things, but in order to, try and synthesize things, I guess. So I guess the question here is, how do we create benevolence? How are we seen to be have ability as leaders, and how we seek to be predictable and have integrity. So I've just broken that down further, which is a model for building trust, which is based on this research by Durkins and Ferring and Colquitt, which is basically saying that the drivers of trust, when we talk about consideration and structure, are this combination of transformation and transactional, how you want to define that, and this idea of organizational justice, organizational fairness, so that's integrity of decision making, which is the three different types of fairness, which I'll cover in the next session. The interactional, procedural and distributed justice, which is so important for organizational change, so I can make unpopular decisions. So the outcome of the decision could be unpopular, but if the process that I follow to get to that decision is seen to be fair, then people are more likely to buy into that decision, even if it's detrimental to them. And that's what the research sort of tells us. So that's really important for building trust. I'm following a very clear process. Contractual breaches as well. Obviously, if I'm seen as a leader to break contract breaches, and that could be hard contract breaches, it could be psychological contract breaches, then I'll undermine trust. And if I'm not seen to be given organizational support, and I think, at a very simple level, whether well-being interventions work or not, I think as a gesture or as a statement of intent by organizations that they do care about their employees, can actually, at that kind of very simple level, can work to build trust, because it shows that you care. And this, regarding people's sense of autonomy, giving them, helping them or allowing them to participate in decision making, which is also the sort of interactional justice part as well. And if we can get those things right, so they seem to be the most significant things in driving trust, then we know the outcomes of trust are, improved task performance. We know that managers are more likely to support their staff, lower turnover intentions, pro-social behaviour, which is so important for organisational change, so people become more collaborative and work in the good of the organisation and have a sense of belonging. People actually believe information, and I think this is important for internal communication, is that you can communicate as much as you want, particularly if it's top down. If the trust isn't there, not only will people probably not believe what you're saying, but they'll probably think that there's a hidden agenda, and it might well undermine change efforts. So in terms of, again, understanding behaviour, linking to other competencies within organisational change, building trust in leadership, has to take place at the same time or before you start doing big communication campaigns, I think. Or you at least need to figure out where that communication is coming from. If the trust is not in leaders and say is in managers, maybe it needs to come from managers. And obviously it ties people in, gets them committed to decisions because they can see their sort of footprint on the decision. Does that kind of make sense as a sort of a model for trust? And please go away and read. I may have missed stuff, but please read around this. There's a lot of research out there on trust in leadership, and that book that I mentioned before as well, Reconsidering Change Management, also has a chapter on this. And in terms of that, is this the same research that you've seen, Angus? The research from Bath University, anyway, with CIPD. So I thought this was interesting because it was.
It is this. I worked at Bath for 3 years, so I worked with Veronica and some of this stuff.
Okay, great. Well,
really good research here.
Sorry, say that again, Angus. Sorry.
Some very good evidence here, which I think is at the kind of the crux of what we're talking about here is, what of the beliefs that we carry forward are actually based on proper research and evidence versus the HBR. Some academic somewhere had a wet dream one night, woken up the next morning and published an article.
Yeah, and I guess the good thing about this as well, this is qualitative, whereas a lot of the research into leadership is more quantitative. So this gives a sort of a richer picture. So I think there's 3 case studies from different organisations going through the financial crisis and how they sort of rebuilt trust. And a key finding was that it was around HR policies. So do they challenge trust levels? It's interesting. I was having a conversation with a big pharmaceutical company, and they were talking about, we want to become more innovative. And their mission statement states that they want to become more innovative, but on the other hand, their sort of values state that they have to get things right first time. And it seems as though their HR policies and procedures as well are quite rigid as well. So if on the one hand you're saying, well, we want to get things right first time and we've got quite rigid processes, then how do you create an innovative culture if the policies and procedures contradicts the kind of culture that you want to encourage? And particularly, if your policies and procedures are too well defined, then you're denying people the opportunity to make mistakes, and you're denying people the ability to make their own decisions. And actually, potentially what you're saying to them is, we don't trust you to make these decisions. So we want everybody to trust everybody, but we don't trust you about whether you work from home, whether you're actually working from home or not, or attending this webinar on trust and leadership or something. And then the other area is looking into what the leadership preferences are. So exactly the conversation that you've been having here, Edwina and others around, so what do we mean by ethical leadership? And different leaders will have different interpretations of what that means. What do we mean by benevolence? What do we mean by being kind and appreciative to our employees? What do we mean by a sense of competence, integrity, and predictability, all these drivers of trust? So some people might think, well, benevolence is giving everybody 50 quid in the organisation. And I actually spoke to, I think it was Thames Water, who'd given £50 worth of, paid £50 for health checks for their staff. And one of the stories that came out of that was one of their staff had a health check and had a heart murmur and was at very high risk of having a heart attack. So essentially saved lives by just spending 50 quid on each employee. And that's a great story, isn't it, to tell back about how much leaders care about their employees. And also leaders as humans. So I think this comes back to your point, Angus, about, okay, I am a leader, I hold power, but I will use that power in a very sort of humane way. And rather than prescribing stories that leaders should tell, that leaders should share their own personal stories and maybe around their own vulnerability, rather than talking about some corporate story that everybody's like, yeah, I heard that one before, or that's just a repackaging of another story that you tried to tell. And if people are allowed to tell their own stories, then obviously they come across as being authentic and vulnerable, which we know is important for gaining trust. So how do we do this at a practical level? Well, I'm bound to have a pitch for evidence-based practice, and I think that's kind of what we're hearing here, that if we're going to make high quality decisions, we're going to involve people in those decisions. We're not going to be so forthright in I know best type leadership scenarios, that we're going to delegate and collaborate on our decisions. Then maybe an evidence-based approach and a clear process, and this is about fair decision making as well, that here we have a clear procedure for making a decision, and then we can see what the outcome of that decision was and discuss whether it was beneficial to the organisation or not. But I believe that evidence-based decision making is part of being ethical. It gives the organisation agility, trust, empowerment, congruence and fairness and confidence, but you can go through this in more detail. And this is what I've used in organisations, which I've sort of called, you can call it what you want, rapid leadership development, agile leadership development. You could even call it DIY leadership development, where you know, we get people, and I think this is supported by the research from Bath and generally, that if we can get leaders just to reflect on their own behaviours and how that impacts on the work of their groups and individuals and the organisation as a whole, and you can do, you know, lots of different assessment tools, you all know about that. And then I use my organisational change capability assessment and try and understand what the linkages are between that leadership capability we're trying to build and other important factors like fairness, for instance. And then we build learning around, okay, so how do we make fair decisions, or how do we create psychological safety? And you can create group learning. So I created action learning sets around specific areas, like the behaviours that we need to exhibit in order to be seen to be making fair decisions and building trust. And there's all sorts of things you can do with MS Teams on that, and having face-to-face conversations, and then review those behaviours, see what worked, what didn't work. And again, this is, you know, having that experimental view of building leadership capability. And apparently, according to the Bath CIPD research, that rewarding people for sort of going through that and building their leadership capability, and rewarding behaviours helps. What we shouldn't be doing is having too many rules, too much control. This was all from that Bath research. And we're running out of time, so I won't take you through the model. There'll be plenty of other opportunities to go through that. But what the model does do is it gives you, so here we can see, this was for a large charity, and you can see the correlations between leadership and resilience here. So that's this wide line here between leadership and resilience. You can see, you know, actually a thinner line between people's self-belief and leadership. So I think these kind of diagrams create conversations around, well, why is there such a strong relationship between our leadership style and the organizational sense of purpose? That's what you'd want. But why isn't there a stronger relationship with giving people self-belief? Maybe we need to dial up you know, how we give people self-belief, and that's something around benevolence. We know that builds trust. So you can then start to understand what the interrelationships are and see the organisation as a system. And we run these e-learning modules as well. So that's it from me on trusting leadership. I know we sort of 5 minutes left, only 5 minutes left. I know we've had some good conversations. Any other points on that? Is that anything else that do you think I've missed, or feedback?
Sorry.
There you go.
Just a great question. So great presentation again. And just in the assessment or this rapid leadership development, are you also looking at what the Bath paper showed? Are you also asking leaders what structures are coming in your way to be not trustful anymore or so? Because I really like this idea that let's say everybody is a good leader per se, but there are maybe structures or maybe not enough story sharing that creates the right environment, so to speak. Are you looking at this somehow?
We did actually get that in, and it's not explicit. I agree, it's not explicit enough in there, and I should put it as more explicitly. So thanks for that. I'll firm up the model with that. But yeah, that did come out. You know, that I really want to do this or exhibit this behaviour, but I can't because something in the HR policy says that I can't, or something. You know. But yeah, no, thank you. I should make that more explicit. Simon, you got your hand up. Sorry, Edwina. I know you. Sorry, Simon's got his hand up, so I'll give him.
Sorry, just going back to the broader palette.
Sorry, you keep breaking up, Simon.
Sorry, broad palette of leadership skills that you referred to in one of these slides. I'm just wondering how many CEOs and senior leaders come from anything outside of management?
Sorry, Simon, we're having trouble hearing you. Could you just type your question into the chat, and Edwina, whilst you're doing that, maybe Edwina, we can hear you, Edwina.
Okay.
So provocative, Alex, which I love, which is why I love your conversations. You've got me thinking about the role of a leader and what we actually want the leader to achieve. What's the outcome we're trying to get a leader to achieve? And I think that, again, gives the context to then the style, the environment, and everything else that happens. You've really got me thinking about the role of a leader and that word leader. So thank you for that. The one thing that I just thought I would add to the pool, which I don't think you've headed into yet, is leadership is not new. We've been living in tribes ever since we evolved. We see tribes as being really important to us. And I just wonder if there's something in anthropology, something in tribes. And the other area I would say that you might want to go digging in, which is my newest favorite area. It's not my newest favorite area, but one of them is around parenting. Now, the reason why I say about parenting is that early child development, parents as leaders, makes a big thing. And I'm talking about adult to adult conversation, not parent to child. But if you have a look in that, specifically around things like Montessori and stuff like that, and the way Montessori invites children and creates their development, because the leadership role a parent takes is actually quite fascinating in that area. Yeah. So, yeah, well, let's chat about that at some point.
No, that is interesting. And yeah, I haven't looked at the anthropology.
I've been looking at it. We've looked at anthropology for a while, but I've just literally been getting into this area of how we parent and lead our children. And I think there's something in that for organisations. I think it would be foolish not to look.
So Simon, you were saying broader palette of leadership skills is interesting. Yeah, that was taken from the idea of place-based leadership. That they're saying that when you should have all these skills really as a leader and be able to dial up and dial them down, which I guess is burned as the sort of situation leadership. So how many CEOs, etc., have come from areas outside of finance or project management? I firmly believe that organisations are still too siloed in their substructure, and there is little of really broad pool that companies draw when appointing. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I don't know how many CEOs of companies come from an HR background. You don't see that, do you, very often? And people say, CEOs are always saying, well, people are our most important asset, and yet in some organisations, HR doesn't even sit at the top table. So yeah, definitely. I have got, if you're interested in, there is this slide on place-based leadership. I don't know if that means anything to you, but I was just researching and exploring this, so that there might be some. I found it really difficult to get any. So somebody else has got their hand up. Finula.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for that, Alex. Such a breath of fresh air in this field. I want to ask about shared leadership, because I'm an organisational change consultant, and mostly the leaders I'm dealing with are working as part of, sometimes it's project leadership, more often it's the organisational executive leadership team. How does this all apply when actually there's not one leader but several who co-own the leadership role?
Yeah, and I think this is where maybe the place-based leadership or contextual leadership sort of helps as well, doesn't it? Because the place-based leadership has, you've got leaders within unions, haven't you? If you've got a unionised organisation, you could have the head of, say, the RMT coming and sitting in the table with you, and they're a leader and you're a leader. You could have a leader of, the staff representative group, couldn't you? If there isn't, you could have a leader of the political party, say, if you're in local council and you're, so yeah. And this is what the place-based leadership is about. It's about when you're in that place, what are the power dynamics that are going on? And yeah, and in that case, I guess the question would be, does one, becomes your sort of collaborative ability, doesn't it, as a leader, to be able to make everybody feel that they are contributing to the decision. In fact, the decision doesn't come from any one particular person. It's coming from, there's an emergent decision-making process, isn't there, I guess, and being aware and open to that. I don't know. Any other thoughts from others on that?
Yeah, I mean, we actually define a leader very differently. So we don't define a leader as an organizational leader. So to your point, it's not a case of the organization chooses who the leaders are. The tribe chooses the leader, and the leader is the person who normally has the safety of the tribe at heart. So somebody who has the hiring and firing rights, which is why you sometimes see the power base in unions, because they actually control who gets fired, who gets to stay and who doesn't. So there are leaders in name who aren't the true leaders of the tribe. And I think it's that differentiation between a tribe supports a leader. And if you've got a leader who's on a 2-year assignment, the tribe teaches them and then they move on to the next one, the tribe knows that they're not going to look after their safety. So a tribe and a member of a tribe will always know who will look after their safety. And it's that followership that creates a leader. So a leader is somebody who people are prepared to follow rather than the organizational definition of it. And co-leadership, dotted lines, doesn't work. On a good day, if you're lucky, it's just a complete myth.
Yeah.
You can argue me on that one, Alex, if you want.
No, and I do, and thanks for that, Edwina. I do agree with a lot of that. I suppose I'm just thinking of some particular organisations I know where actually leadership is, there is no one single person.
So it's like divorcing parents. It's like divorcing parents. So unless the two leaders who are sharing the leadership role are entirely consistent, it's going to fall apart because you can't please both of them. And it's the most ineffective way because I don't know who to please and what to do. I'm going to paralyze. I'm not going to take a risk, or I'm just going to run around doing whatever I want to do because I feel safe outside of it. Because nobody will punish me because they'll all point at the other one.
But that is an interesting challenge, actually.
Yeah.
From Fionnuala. I think. Are there any organisations out there that don't have leaders per se?
Yes.
I guess there are statutory obligations for having a CEO and someone accountable.
So I was chatting. So holacracy is a big one that is self-managing leadership, and it's a big field of it. And I was actually talking to a guy who works at House Space, a guy called David Donaldson. Again, he's a change agent. And he's like us. He challenges the status quo. And they basically define their own roles and they come together in a very, very different way. Now, I have a mental block on that because my assumption about humans is we like to be in tribes. It makes us feel safe. So being in this place where I'm not clear on who has my back, I struggle to see how that might work. But for some organizations, it works absolutely brilliantly. I just can't reconcile what my brain tells me to be true, but that may be a fault in my brain, not a fault in the theory. And I recognize that.
Good. That's good. We can recognize those things.
Exactly.
It's bound to be the theory, though, at the end of the day. That's wrong. Right.
I would like to believe it to be true, but I'd also like to believe a groundswell uprising to be true. And in the world of change, I've very rarely seen that. So.
Yeah. We can either change ourselves or change the world, can't we? Any other questions on?
Thank you, Alex.
Good. I'm glad that was helpful, and thanks so much for the contributions, Simon, Angus, Fionnuala, Edwina, as always, and I think others have left. Brilliant. Thanks, guys. I hope to see you on the next one.
Thanks so much. That's great.
Thanks for creating the space, Alex. A great conversation and well done.
Thanks, Edwina. See you soon.